the weather finally cooling down here in Asheville, it was time to turn my attention to the grading work outside the shop. So as many of you have seen, there have been some moisture issues inside the shop, and while these have largely been solved by getting the gutters cleaned and functioning, I figured I should go ahead and tackle the exterior grading work as well. So the main problem area was to the right of the shop, and as you can see, the grading here was about as bad as it could be, funneling any surface water right towards the shop walls and foundation. To fix this, my plan was to essentially just shift the dirt around, with the end goal of the water being diverted into a swale, kind of a small valley about 8 feet from the building. Before getting to work, I cleared out the area, removing the existing corrugated gutter drain pipe, and then my weapons of choice for this project arrived. In this case, those were a mini skid steer in the form of a Toro Dingo and a small excavator, both from the folks at Sunbelt Rentals. The driver got the machines unloaded with the help of this super cool truck bed, which could be remotely slid and tilted to assist in unloading, which was pretty awesome. And once the machines were off, I could get to work. To start, I needed to do a lot of clearing work, removing the grass, small stumps, and trees which were gonna be in my way. And organic material does not compact well, and roots and stumps will rot over time, causing a lot more issues, so I wanted to get rid of as much of the brush, grass, leaves, and other plant material as I could. This was also really good practice so I could get back into the swing of things operating the excavator before I got closer to the building. I continued working around the back of the shop, and I wanted to do a little more grading back here as well, although I don't think the grading was nearly as bad on this side of the shop. I did also decide to go ahead and take down this larger tree since it was in the way of the grading work, and also dumped a ton of leaves right into my gutters. Taking this thing down required quite a bit of digging around the base of the tree, but eventually I got it pushed over and dragged it into the woods behind the shop. Unfortunately, I also killed my GorillaPod, which I was using to mount the GoPro to the excavator, in the process.
Oh shoot, broke the tripod.
From there, I just continued clearing brush around the back of the shop, and then wrapped up day one with a little dingo work to start backfilling the area near the right shop wall, since I was getting down to some good quality dirt finally. I started day two with some more backfilling, this time with the excavator, but while digging, I also found the old clogged corrugated drain line underground, and it was of course surrounded by a bunch of roots, so I worked on digging those up before continuing. Once that was done, I could start backfilling in earnest, and I was able to really start building up the soil level against the wall by taking buckets of dirt from the area where I wanted to create the swale. Between passes, I compacted the soil by running over the area with the excavator, tracking it in, and you can see I got a little too close to the building as the soil compacted and ended up denting one of the metal siding panels slightly. As I got close to where I wanted to be depth-wise for the swale, I ran into what seemed to be a trash and burn pit from when the building was originally built back in the 70s. And I found offcuts of the metal siding, old beer cans, and shocks, which matches up with the building being a chop shop at one point in its history. I threw away what I dug up and kept digging, only to find some more beer bottles. These guys were pretty thirsty, evidently, and I found some pretty cool antique straw bottles, which I went ahead and recycled. From there, I continued cleaning up the grading, widening the swale with the dingo, and smoothing out some of the areas before jumping back into the excavator to do more compacting. And I was able to really get things looking good at this point, with the swale starting to take shape and the grading at the wall looking pretty solid. I kept working around the back of the building, with my next target being the low point at the back left corner of the shop. Once again, I moved dirt around to backfill this area and found another trash pile back here. Thankfully, I was able to really clean up this area and get it smoothed out enough to be able to pull my truck around back, which will be super handy for getting things in and out of the attic space. I called it a wrap for day 3 at that point, and we ended up having some unexpected rain overnight, so I could see how the grading was working based on where the water was flowing. Thankfully, the swale was working as expected, diverting the water away from the building. And you can see this even worked where the gutter downspouts were draining out, since the corrugated pipe was removed for the time being. And there was a giant puddle where I'd piled up the dirt at the bottom of the hill at the street, so I focused on getting that cleaned up with the dingo, piling up more dirt against the wall. Before finishing up the grading work, I needed to deal with the rearmost boarded up window opening, and I didn't want to just bury this area as I didn't want the fiber cement panel rotting over time, so I figured I could whip up a quick DIY window weld. So I wanted to use up some of the material we salvaged during the demolition work earlier in the shop series, and I figured this pile of treated 4x4s would be perfect for the window well. I started by cutting the 4x4s down to the miter saw, and to limit the exposed end grain, I mitered the corners of the window well. And these window openings were 4 feet wide, and that's why I couldn't just run out and buy an off-the-shelf window well, at least not in my area. I got the pieces cut to size, and with the material I had, the inside depth of the window well ended up at just over 7 inches. This was fine though, since I obviously didn't need to worry about people exiting through this window. Next, I assembled each layer of the window well using 3-inch screws, squaring up the corners as best I could. And as you can see, this material had warped quite a bit over the years, but that didn't really matter for this project. After getting the 4 layers assembled, I could attach the layers to each other. And the only screws I had on hand that were long enough to go through these 4x4s were these massive 6-inch lag screws. I started by countersinking a hole using a spade bit so the head of the screw would sit below the surface of the 4x4. Next, I drilled a through hole since these screws need a clearance hole due to their large diameter. Once that was done, I could drive in the lag screw, but it turned out my clearance hole wasn't nearly deep enough, so the screw wasn't going in. To fix this, I pulled out a longer drill bit, and after drilling the hole with that bit, the screw went in much more easily. I repeated the process in a few more spots to really tie the 2 rows together, and then I could repeat the process again for the second row. And I made sure to mark out my hole location so I didn't accidentally drive these screws into the screws in the previous row, but other than that, this was just more of the same. Once I had all 4 rows assembled, I wanted to really waterproof the window well since it would be completely buried after installation. And I definitely could have just painted the whole thing, but I didn't want to wait for the paint to dry. Instead, I figured I could use up an extra roll of zip tape I had on hand, and I wrapped the entire exterior face of the window well with zip tape, overlapping it to get a good seal, and I also rolled the tape as I went. About 10 minutes later, I had a zip tape entombed window well, so I could figure out how I was going to mount the window well to the wall. I picked up these galvanized angle brackets, which seemed like the perfect solution, and I got them attached to the window well with some beefy 2.5-inch screws. With the brackets attached, I could move outside and get the area ready for installation. I dug out the dirt to about 6 inches below the window opening to leave room for adding some gravel inside the window well later. Once that was done, we could move the window well in place, and then I could check it for level. And it was ever so slightly out of level, but a few taps with a hammer got it leveled out. Next, I could get the window well attached to the wall, and I used some Tapcon screws for this. And I drilled the holes using my SDS drill, and before adding the screws, I also added a bit of silicone just to help seal up the holes in the wall. Finally, I could add the screws, and I should mention that I picked up a new SDS Plus drill bit, which solved my problem with my Tapcon screws stripping out, which I talked about in an earlier episode. With that, the window well was done, so we could get the dirt feathered out up against the building, filling in the area around the window well, and getting the grading finalized. The last thing to do to wrap up the grading work was to add some erosion control matting, and this will help keep the dirt from washing away. And I don't really want grass here since I don't want to add weekly mowing to my shop maintenance, and the straw matting will help keep things together while I figure out what I want to do over here. I got this matting from an agricultural supply store, and it was super easy to install. We just rolled it out and tacked it in place with sod staples as we went. I cut the mat once we got to the bottom of the hill and started again from the top, overlapping the pieces by about 2 feet. We repeated the process for a third row, and once that was done, we could call the grading work complete. With the grading work done for the time being, the next big project on my shop building was adding a huge front porch or awning to the front of the building. And I figured while I had the excavator and dingo rented, I could go ahead and get started on the porch by digging the footings. So as with any construction project, I started with the layout work, getting a few string lines set up to represent both sides of the building, as well as where the posts for the porch will land. We used the 3-4-5 method to make sure we set the first pair of stakes square to the building, and in this case we used 12, 16, and 20 as our numbers to give us a more accurate location. Using these longer measurements also meant the stakes were more out of the way of the excavator. Once the first stake was set, I pulled a string line from the building, hooking onto a screw I added to the trim. I used this method I learned from my buddy Eric Perkins to tighten the string, first spinning my finger to create a loop, and then pulling each side of the string in opposite directions to tighten it down. I then pulled the excess string towards the stake, which locked the string in place, and then tied it off at the stake. I repeated the process at the other end of the building, and then we could set our next pair of stakes. And these stakes needed to be 6 feet from the front of the building, so we measured and marked on the line at both sides, and then pulled a line between those points to set our stakes. We repeated the 3-4-5 method at each string intersection to make sure they were square to each other, which they were, so we could move on with marking out the post locations. I had modeled the porch in SketchUp, and I created a drawing with the post locations for reference, but as you can see, I somehow completely spaced when creating the plans and set the rightmost posts over 16 feet apart, but we'll come back to that. We marked the location of the rightmost post on the string line with a Sharpie, and then used a longer tape to mark the far left post, which was 55 feet from the right post.
Cool. All right, good to go.
As we marked each point on the string line, we also transferred that mark to the ground using a chalk line as a plumb bob and using marking paint to make a mark on the ground. We continued on down the rest of the porch, marking the center of the post locations until we had marked all 5 posts. Once that was done, I could come back and mark out the footings, which were 2 feet by 2 feet square in this case. Now, this was probably pretty massive overkill, but concrete is fairly cheap, and I figured giving ourselves some wiggle room on the post locations would be beneficial. As it turned out, this couldn't have been more true with my over 16-foot beam snafu, and I am so glad I went this route in retrospect. After marking all the footing locations, it was time to bring in the machinery and start digging the footings with the excavator. I emptied the excess dirt into a wheelbarrow as I dug, and I'm so glad I did, as we would have had a huge mess to clean up otherwise. So we were shooting for a footing depth of about 18 inches, which is below the frost line of 12 inches in this area. And you want the bottom of your footings well below the frost line, as this will prevent the footings from being shifted or damaged by frost heaving as the ground freezes and thaws through the colder months. After digging with the excavator, the footings still needed to be cleaned up by hand, and we found out just how hard this dirt was while cleaning up the footings. Once they were cleaned up, we could get the rebar added to reinforce the footings, and we used number 4 rebar here cut into 18-inch lengths, and I used 4 pieces arranged in a grid in each footing. To help get the rebar up off the ground, I used these rebar chairs, but these specific chairs also hold the rebar pieces together, so you don't have to use any wire ties, which was pretty nice. The rebar pieces just clipped into the chairs, and then I could drop the whole assembly into the footing. We then repeated the process on the rest of the footings and were ready for concrete, at least I thought. After doing some more measuring, I realized I was going to come up short on the amount of concrete I had ordered, which was 1 yard in this case, unless I formed up the area where I had overdug the footings with the excavator. And if you've ever dug small square holes with an excavator, you'll know how hard it is to make those holes perfectly square, especially when you're dealing with dirt this hard. Thankfully, I whipped up some quick forms using scraps I had in the shop, and these really helped to reduce the overall volume of concrete I needed. I got the forms added just in time as the concrete truck rolled up about an hour later, so we could get the footings poured. Thankfully, the driver was able to move the chute right above the footings, so we didn't need a pump for this project. And this concrete was a standard 3000 psi mix, and it had a pretty low slump, which was good for my purposes. Since I ordered just enough concrete, we started by partially filling all the footings, and then came back and topped them up just to make sure we didn't come up short. As the concrete was poured, we smoothed out the surface of the footing with a transfer shovel, a 2x4 as a screed, and even a small trowel. And I wish I had thought ahead and picked up a larger trowel, but I didn't really need the surface of the footings to be perfectly smooth here. Also, I've just gotta say, there is something so satisfying about watching concrete get poured. It's pretty incredible that this liquid mix ends up turning into solid rock in just a few hours, and I'm hoping to do more concrete work in the future so I can feel a little bit more confident at it. Anyway, we got all the footings poured with just enough concrete to top up the last footing, and then let the footings dry over the weekend before starting on the porch build.
Man, it is a huge relief to have all of this grading work done. I think it's going to make a big difference in the moisture levels in the shop. And now we can move on to this big porch project. So go ahead and get subscribed and ring the notification bell so you don't miss that video and all my future videos. I'll have links to all the tools and materials I use in this video in the video description below. And lastly, if you want to support me, I sell merch, I have plans available, and I have both Patreon and YouTube members set up. All right, thanks for watching, y'all, and until next week, happy build.